Let's take a deep dive into Nigeria's 2026 budget, shall we? It was proposed at 58.18 trillion naira by the President Bola Tinubu this week before the National Assembly, a joint session of the National Assembly, by the way. Now, in his presentation, the President spoke about fiscal discipline. The President spoke about fiscal discipline and also consolidating reforms and driving shared prosperity. He also promised an end to the long-standing practice of rolling over unspent budget funds from one year to the next.
But analysts are raising questions about how realistic the revenue assumptions are. What happens if revenue targets aren't met, and whether delays in passing the budgets could slow down implementation and stall key projects? So, to help us unpack and get the implications, especially around funding gaps and implementation, we're joined by Iniobong Usen, Senior Program Coordinator at the International Budget Partnership. Iniobong, you're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Let's start with the budget size. Nigeria's proposed 2026 budget. What's your take on the size? Currently, it's 58.18 trillion naira. From your perspective, are the revenue projections underpinning this proposal realistically, given current economic performance?
Yeah, thank you, Maz. And good morning, compliments of the season to you and Judith. This current budget is equally suffering from some of the legacy issues that, our fiscal management and planning has suffered over the past couple of years. If you look at the budget size of 58 trillion naira and you juxtapose that with what our budget implementation has been over the last couple of years, the facts tell us that with what we post to see next year, it's largely unlikely that we would be able to raise the resources needed to implement this budget. And you spoke rightly to some of the issues that other analysts have highlighted as one of the major challenges with the implementation of this budget for next year. Nigeria suffers from a revenue optimism bias, where instead of setting realistic targets for what we have the capacity to raise, we sort of confuse ambition with delusion. Ambition is setting very challenging goals that you have the capacity to achieve. But what we've seen, year after year with the planning process for what our capacity is to raise revenue is, far from what the reality on the ground is. And the implication for this is that when your budget fails, it means that a child cannot go to school as a result of, a lot of the issues that are affecting the out-of-school children. It means that a woman who is pregnant, right, and needs to deliver would not have access to the basic facilities, and that's what's responsible for the high maternal mortality rate. It also means that the number of graduates you are churning out on a yearly basis do not have, access to opportunities to, contribute effectively to the economy and raise revenues to meet their basic needs. So budget failures are not just numbers on papers, but then they have real implications for the lives of the everyday Nigerian. And that's why I'm very happy that with regards to the issues around our fiscal matters, with the budgets, with the tax reforms, that there's a lot more heightened interest in how government raise revenues, how they plan to spend those revenues, and then account for those revenues at the end of the day.
Right. One of President Bola Tinubu's priorities is ending budget rollovers, where unspent funds from previous years carry over in the next. But there are many others who have said that 2025 budget has not yet been fully implemented and some projects have not even been done. So one has to ask about the potentials or potential benefits of this change and what challenges exist in making it a reality, when there are cases of uncompleted projects or lack of full implementation of the budget in terms of funds.
So this is also one of the legacy issues that advocates like myself have been hammering on over the past couple of years. You cannot have multiple budgets funded with one revenue year after year. It runs against the core principles of, budgeting and fiscal management. I liken this to you trying to cook 4 different meals or 3 different meals with 1 pot and 1 stove. And that's just tantamount to, concussion that will come out of it at the end of the day. Our budgets are not linked to whether our long-term development plans or our medium-term development plans that you expect the federal government, the subnational government, and the private sector to contribute to, which largely instructs what our growth patterns would be. And so this practice of rolling budgets over and using a single year's revenue to fund those budgets is largely unsustainable. And it stems from, the practice of, the allocation of resources to projects within the budget. It's another issue that we must curb. In addition to this, is the arbitrary insertion of projects into the budget that the National Assembly is largely responsible for. I mean, if you look over the last 3 or 4 years, you see that on a yearly basis, an average of 6,000 to 7,000 projects are inserted into the budget after the executive has submitted its plan. And what that makes the budget become is that it's simply unimplementable because these budgets are driven by assumptions that drive what your revenue projections are, that looks at some macro fundamentals like your economic growth rate, the inflation, what the exchange rate would be, oil price, oil production at the end of the day. And so when you insert a lot of these projects that did not go through any sort of real thought process, but had served as a means to reach their constituencies in quotes, there's no real way of funding these projects. And at the end of the day, what you see are these sort of projects that do not tie to medium or long-term development, competing with what exactly a government should be, spending or expending very lean resources on. And then this leads to government borrowing irresponsibly, for the want of a better word, or arbitrarily to cater to a lot of these projects in a way that is not coordinated to be able to drive growth and economic development at the end of the day. So while I agree that this practice must stop, it's also that now that the ball has been pushed into the arena of the National Assembly, that also that practice of arbitrarily inserting projects that do not go through any sort of rigor or scrutiny in terms of how that contributes to national planning, development, or even the viability of those projects to be able to raise people out of poverty, that practice must equally stop. And then the National Assembly equally needs to rise up to its constitutional role of effective and functional oversight. That's practice of
Iniobong, let me jump on what you've just said there, because it confuses me how the ends to these rollovers is actually going to help. Is it going to help efficient implementation of these budgets, or make sure that whatever the projects that they are being allocated to are done efficiently, or is it just simply going to increase year-end spending, just to rush and make sure that let's spend it before the year runs out? How is it going to affect positively these budgets and how they're used?
So the truth is that the revenues are not even available to spend till the year end. And that's the real dilemma.
So then why are we talking about rollovers then? If there's no rollover, why is it a topic? Why is it something that he's big on?
So the issue about the rollover is so that you do not create new projects, about 20,000 of them, that you do not have the capacity to equally fund. And so why don't you take these projects that have been that have had funds allocated to, enacted by the National Assembly and signed into law by the president, right? And move them into 2026 as against creating new sets of projects that you do not have the capacity to fund. And then you stop that practice of rolling that over. But where I differ from the president is the optimism that we would be able to fund all of those projects. Mind you, 70% of which have been rolled over from 2025, for which, literally nothing, has been expended on, that we have that capacity to be able to, cater to those projects by Q1 2023. The truth is that the revenues we need to implement those projects in 2026 would still come in 2026. And then if you look at, what the drivers of that revenue would be, oil revenue, Nigeria has about is reported to have about 20 million liters of crude that is just sitting somewhere looking for buyers. There's a glut in the market because there are cheaper alternatives in the Middle East. And so it's projected that in the first half of 2026, the price of crude will drop. And so that optimism with oil price and production does not coincide with what the projected realities would be in 2026. I know that we also expect increased revenues from the tax reforms because there will be better tax administration. We're expecting a lot more people to be brought into the tax net.
All right.
But there's also going to be an implementation lag, meaning that by the time these laws will come into effect, and then the authorities will be able to run with it, build the administrative capacity of the NRS and then the various state IRSs to be able to raise revenue, deploy the technology required, for the efficiency that we need in collection. That would be happening maybe close to the beginning of the second quarter, as the case may be. So also that optimism that we will be able to raise enough revenues to, cater to all of these projects we are rolling over, for me, is equally highly ambitious. I do not see that happening.
Highly ambitious indeed.
Risk with elections for 2026. And with every pre-election year, governance usually takes the back seat, and politicking is at the fore of what it is. Technocrats, politicians will be going back to their basics to go and query for votes that they expect citizens to cast.
Okay, Iniobong, there's another thing. There's another thing I want to get your attention on, and of the budget, the most allocation was to security, 5.41 trillion. That's the biggest we've ever seen. Let's compare this to previous years. And especially that Nigeria is going through a situation right now that is causing international attention when it comes to internal security. Will 5.41 trillion naira be enough to make a change in the security situation that Nigeria finds itself when you compare it to the previous year's allocation or the year from before that? Do you see anything significantly changing when it comes to the actual state of security in Nigeria because of this budget?
I'm an optimist. And as you know, with the Nigerian security situation, it's not just a money problem we have. We also have an expenditure problem. If you look at what we've expended over the last couple of years, there's no accountability for how these funds have been utilized. We have a very weak, accountability system. There's almost no consequence management for mismanagement of public funds. And when you do not, create examples that serve as deterrents, these malpractices continue. And so when it comes to security, it's not just a money problem. I know that we do not allocate enough resources to buy the equipment required to be able to fight this war head on. If you look at also the welfare system for our soldiers who are at the forefront, a lot more could be done. But even beyond that, I'm a pragmatist. I'm somebody who looks at, even within the existing resource envelopes, that we have to solve the myriad of our challenges. Are we getting value for money? Is every naira or dollar that we deploy to solve, our problems actually fighting those problems? Or are a large chunk of it, being lost to, embezzlement, fraud, malpractices? And for me, that's where the real issue is. So it's not really, for me, about increasing the budget to any of these sectors. Because when you increase the budget without solving for the systemic issues, what you are doing is increasing the fiscal space for fraud or corruption. And I always liken this to, I always try to address this, showing examples with the different states. So if you look at the different states and what their capacity to collect revenues, I wouldn't say raise revenues, because at the end of the day, if you look at the oil-producing states and you put them side by side with states that are not oil-producing, and you look at the huge resources that go to oil-producing states, maybe like Akwa Ibom, like Rivers, like Bayelsa, and you look at the resources going to states like Gombe, if you pick a child from Akwa Ibom in a village somewhere in Akwa Ibom, maybe in Ibuno, where the oil is being produced, and then the state receives huge resources as a result of 13% derivation, and you pick a child from a remote village in Gombe, you can't tell the difference between both.
Right.
Meaning that the huge resources going to these subnationals are not translating into improved livelihoods for the citizens of those states.
Right.
So
And,
just throwing money at a problem without solving for the systemic issues doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So while we have a revenue problem that does not allow us to allocate resources adequately to solve our problems, more importantly, we have an expenditure problem that allows for waste, allows for embezzlement, allows for the fizzling of our lean resources to solve more of these problems.
All right.
And if we tackle those systemic problems,
all right.
just
Iniobong, Maiwa is unfortunately not here and asking. Iniobong, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate you for doing this with us. It's very interesting that tentatively the cost of the Calabar Coastal Highway is about 15 trillion naira, just as we have 58.18 trillion naira for our budget. And we're just, still in the first phase of the project. Only God only knows, when we're talking about accountability and transparency, what a fraction of this 2026 budget will look like if it's going into that project as well. I wish there was enough time for us to continue the discussion, but here's where we draw the curtain.